Hi folks, in this video I would like to talk a little bit about Frank Sibley's article Aesthetic Concepts. So I'm going to share the screen with you. Okay. Frank Sibley is a British philosopher, or was a British philosopher, who worked mainly in aesthetics. He's mainly interested in aesthetics and what aesthetic terms have in common. He's interested here in this, in fact, in what aesthetic terms have in common. So for instance, words like delicate, vivid, balanced, and unified. To support application of an aesthetic term, we often use other aesthetic terms. For instance, we might use the term dainty because, we may support the application of the term dainty, for instance, by saying it's dainty because of delicacy and harmony of its lines. So that delicacy and harmony are also aesthetic terms. But we often use non-aesthetic terms too. So for instance, delicate because of its pastel shades and curving lines. So the flow of its lines, smooth flow of its lines would be aesthetic. But pastel shades and curving lines are just descriptions. Okay. When we ourselves can't quite say what non-aesthetic features make something aesthetic, the good critic often puts his finger on it. In short, aesthetic words ultimately depend on the presence of features which do not require any exercise of taste to perceive. Whatever kind of dependence this is, non-aesthetic features can never serve as conditions for applying aesthetic terms. So in other words, if you have terms like harmony or delicacy, you can never just use non-aesthetic terms like curvy lines, blue of certain figures as conditions for the aesthetic terms. Features can function, features which function as conditional for a term, some group of them is sufficient to ensure the application of that term. So for instance, and this is the non-aesthetic case, words like lazy and intelligent, there's a point where we have enough features to warrant application of the term, say lazy or intelligent. But aesthetic concepts are not condition governed in this way. Aesthetic concepts are different. Aesthetic concepts are different. For instance, we can say, if he has A, B, and C, he is lazy. But what we cannot say is if the vase or vase is pale pink, somewhat curving, lightly modeled, therefore it must be delicate. Things may be described to us in non-aesthetic terms as fully as we please, but we are never in the position of having to admit the aesthetic term. In other words, when we use non-aesthetic terms to serve as conditions for aesthetic terms, there's always a possibility that a person who hears these non-aesthetic terms can question whether or not the object has the aesthetic terms. Okay. Let's see. I've not merely been claiming, he says, Sibley's not merely been claiming that there are no sufficient conditions for taste concepts. They could be similar to defeasible concepts, where defeasible means capable of being annulled or voided or terminated. But for defeasible concepts, in the absence of overriding or voiding features some group of features would be sufficient conditions for applying the term. To help understand how the critic supports his judgment and gets his audience to see what he sees, I shall attempt a brief, this is Sibley attempts a brief description of the methods that critics use. So one method may be the critic simply points out the non-aesthetic features. The critic may mention the aesthetic features directly. So in other words, number one, simply pointing out the non-aesthetic features in order for the subject, the person, the non-critic, to perhaps indirectly, through the non-aesthetic features, begin to see what the aesthetic features are. Mentioning the aesthetic features directly, linking remarks about aesthetic and non-aesthetic features. We can, the critic can use similes and metaphors. The critic can use contrasts, comparisons, and reminiscences. Repetition and reiteration. Can use voice, expression, nods, looks, gestures to try to get the person to see what it is that the critic sees. And that's it for this video. I hope that this short video has helped you to understand this very interesting reading. Thanks very much for watching. Bye-bye.